Thank you for joining with us in giving and receiving. We're so grateful for each of you and here with us. We are ready to move into our second large group conversation. And I will introduce those who will be leading it for us. This last section took a little bit longer than we were planning, so we'll probably let this conversation go a little bit late just so that you know what to expect in terms of timing. We have three storytellers. The first will be Erica Littlewolf. You just saw her and perhaps met her as she is a part of our steering committee and is up here talking with you. She will be sharing a story of the meaning of love from Indigenous contexts. Then we have a story of the meaning of love from the context of militarization from Arki Martin Mayama. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that incorrectly. She goes by Pia, and she is a woman in the Philippines who unfortunately was not able to travel here to be amongst us, but who has prepared a wonderful video message for us, and so we will be hearing from her in that way. The third story we will hear comes from Linda Gainer-Fici, who was also up here just a moment ago, and she will be talking about the meaning of love when it comes to thinking about loving our enemies. And then after those stories, we will hear from Melinda Berry, who will be the theological responder to the stories that we hear, tying them together and helping us think about the underpinnings of them that may have significance for our lives. So let's give the three of them and Pia, who is not with us, a warm welcome.
Good afternoon. I realize that I'm still trying to negotiate the relationship between me and this mic. I feel like I have to stand close, but hearing myself, I'm like, no. Before I delve in, I'm going to speak in my traditional language and acknowledge the indigenous people of this land. Recognizing that I am Northern Cheyenne from southeastern Montana. Thus, this is not my homeland. I'm also here as a guest, but recognizing the indigenous people that still run on this land and who have also died for this land. For this session, I have been tasked with, I got two questions that I had to focus on. And one says, what does it mean to love within an indigenous context? The other was, what can we learn about Christian love from an indigenous context? I was overwhelmed when I got this in my inbox. I thought, this is a huge question. It's a historical question. I could spend years unpacking this. In fact, I did, because I did my undergraduate in Indigenous Studies. And looking at that, it played out yesterday. Historical trauma with Native people is not only historic, happened yesterday, it's still happening today. But for this conference, I decided to hold in a little bit and focus on one particular issue within the Christian church, which is the boarding schools. I always find when I bring this up that I need to give a little bit of a context before I speak. We're not necessarily given a lot of this information in our schooling, and if we are, it's usually bypassed maybe through one paragraph. There are state, we'll call them Indian boarding schools, and Canada, they're First Nations boarding schools, residential schools, all the same concept. They were in the 19th and 20th centuries in Canada and the US. And what they did is educate Indigenous kids, Native American children from the reservations within a Euro-American standard. At the height within the US, in 1973, there were 60,000 students from Native reservations that were taken to these schools. And one of the most well-known ones within the United States is Carlisle Indian School, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is now a military college. As I said before, they were a tool that was used for assimilation. And the theme that went with that was kill the Indian, save the man. How these schools ran was they were given funding from the federal federal government, and it went to religious organizations, religious church groups, in order to school these children. We can go a little bit removed from that, but when we look at it, what happened to these children is they were taken from their home communities and their clan systems and their family systems, and went and were forced to speak English probably by the age of 5. Most indigenous people have long hair, and it's a spiritual connection. It's our connection to the Creator. And what they did was cut those child's hair off. And we were taught from a young age to only let certain people within our families touch our hair. And so here are people we don't know cutting their hair and doing different sorts of things like that, putting in groups of with other students that are not from their tribe, not allowed to see their siblings who they would have had grown up with and had close relationships with. They were punished for speaking their language, and all sorts of abuse took place. And we can also maybe feel a little bit removed from that. But to break it down a little more, there were 3 Mennonite-run residential schools within the United States, and also Mennonite-run residential schools within Canada. In an effort to help right this wrong, Canada has started a truth and reconciliation process. They have national events within the provinces and also do regional events. Lorraine, Iris, and Carolyn and I had the opportunity to travel to British Columbia to witness one of these events. We sat in a talking circle, which was put on by a lot of the church leaders, and people knew ahead of time, submitted their names to be a part of this talking circle. So it was survivors who wanted to tell their story and get an apology from the people from the church that represented those institutions. The circle we sat in was mixed company, men and women, indigenous people, non-indigenous people. And the one story I'd like to share comes from a woman. And I remember her speaking, and at the very end she said, these are the stories, we don't want to tell, but we have to tell these stories. And sometimes within us, if we carry those stories, we find it hard to tell. But if we tell it here, we expect that as a listener, you will tell these stories other places, so that the truth can come out, the truth can be known, and the pain can be worked towards healing. It was interesting because we went around in circle process, and when it got to her, she was very angry, as she should be, and she spoke about being abused by nuns, and she was actually a 3rd-generation survivor. Her grandmother and her mother had gone to boarding school, and she had as well. And she said she never heard her parents tell her that they loved her, nor did she ever tell her children that she loved them. And she was just mimicking the parenting skills she learned from the nuns. As the circle went on, she talked about her husband and how angry she was with him because she went to a Catholic boarding school and he was a devout Catholic. And now every time he practiced his faith, she was angry with him. And throughout their relationship, they had to struggle to find that, and also struggle to find how to raise their children within the context of his religion and her adversity to it because of her abuse. And I remember one profound story she told about witnessing and trying to help children being abused when they would speak their language, and how she couldn't understand. They would teach, Jesus came and he did this, he did this, he did this. But every time that they beat her, they said, in the name of Jesus. And so she wondered, who is this Jesus? If you tell me he is love, then why is he abusing me? And she talked about, she could understand maybe that since you are telling me I am a dirty Indian, maybe this is why. But she could not understand why you would beat your white children as well. There were nuns who got pregnant in the boarding schools and also had children. So she said, as a young child, she was wrestling with trying to understand that maybe you could do this to me, but I'm still trying to find humanity in you, that you would beat children that look like you and perhaps could be your own children. What came out of the boarding school was a lot of shame. And when I look at this and I listen to her story and I go to my analytical brain and realize I would rather go there because I too am a survivor of a parent that went to boarding school and 2 grandparents that went to boarding school. And so I go to my analysis and I look at that story, and what I say is, what from this story is what is it saying to me? What what did this Christian God or this Christian Jesus, what did he bring to indigenous people? And I think when I break it down, there was an assumption that we didn't know God. In order to come and impose this on someone, you're saying you do not know God, you do not know Jesus, or the way in which you know them is not the way which is right. What also comes with that is either or thinking. Either you're a Christian and you quit being a native indigenous person who God made you to be, or you stay indigenous and you cannot become Christian. And it also what comes with that in my mind is you say one thing and you do another. And it speaks to what Corinthia shared yesterday about the action behind the word love. And also what I think is forget what has been done. We still have missionaries coming into our reservation that want to glaze over and look at the problems we have and come to fix things without realizing the historical nature of these problems. And one thing that I'm delving into and trying further to understand was even this assumption that we would be on the same understanding as to what love means. I briefly glanced over my Cheyenne dictionary and I found there were 6 words for love, and that there were 12 other versions of it depending on who you were speaking to and within what context. But in none of those were they ever a noun. They were always an action-oriented word. Thanks, Lucia. So when I look at that and I say, what does this Christian love look like, from my perception and hearing this? Then I have to switch to my indigenous concept. And what are indigenous people? What am I saying about Christian love from my own space? And what's coming out of communities is healing. And not only for an individual, but for our communities as a whole, and also for our institutions that we function in. So what does this look like for me to look at my own trauma from my parents having gone to boarding school, to look at the church, the Mennonite church I grew up in, as being a part of that colonization system, and then looking to the whole of Mennonite church who participated in boarding schools for Native people. And it also means that I don't call myself a Christian. If you're familiar with the late Richard Twist, he never called himself a Christian, and this is a common movement within Native communities. If you call yourself a Christian, you're associating with this wrongdoing. So what he has come about to say is we say that we live the Jesus way, and that sets it apart from Christianity, and I think gives it more action. And so you'll see that in a lot of indigenous communities. And also to recognize that we hear differently. We're still at some places where we're not allowed to have a drum within a church, but we can use a piano. My church started singing songs in our traditional language, and so we can use our language too. And just doing different things that are more specific to us. But when I look at that and I have this perception of people from the outside, and then I can look at my own community, look at myself, and see that we have this perception of what we are and the work we can do. And we also know within our community, since this harm was done together, we realize we must also heal together. So we're doing our work, and so I wonder, how do we do this work collectively? And so I go back to what Laura shared last night. Where do we go from here? How do you need to be healed? And looking at that individually, how do you need to be healed? In your community, how do we need to be healed? And more broadly, how does the Mennonite church need to be healed?